which sets up the case study that I will begin and we will end with. And that is the case of global climate change. Let's begin, and I'm not going to make a pronouncement. I'm simply going to ask you to help walk through a process. I had the honor of co-writing an amicus briefing in the case of Massachusetts versus the EPA. Now, the case was that Massachusetts felt that because we're not taxing and sequestering CO2, carbon dioxide, from the backs of cars and light trucks, note, not heavy trucks, cars and light trucks, that global warming was happening as a result, and therefore Massachusetts was losing its beaches. Okay? So as many of you know, in the judiciary, you need two things to go to court. One is you need standing. So Massachusetts had standing. They were being harmed or imminent harm. And number two, it has to be justiciable. That is, there must be a remedy that the court can provide, otherwise you're wasting everybody's time. So Massachusetts got other states to join in saying, our beaches are eroding, our resources are going away, and so we want to sue. So this made it up to town here. And town, the Supreme Court, both sides essentially were saying, let us see if we've got this straight. Based on what you're claiming is consensus science, you are here as a sovereign state putting a federal agency on report for not punishing you enough. Correct. Right. You need to be taxing us more. You need to be harming us. You need to be sequestering the fumes, the CO2 specifically from cars and light trucks. Now, for all of you who are also in this town, you know that you'd have to guess that why are not heavy trucks involved? I would just have to guess K Street and Teamsters, and I'm not worried about them. Even though, in terms of production of human-provided CO2, heavy trucks produce 3/4. So what we're involved here is a scientific analysis of this claim and what are the actual numbers. So I want to point out, and I'll come back to the concept of a NESHAP, which is a measure of toxicity, and that until a few days ago, carbon dioxide has never been considered a toxin. It now is considered a toxin. This goes back to Massachusetts versus the EPA, so let's walk through that. Again, the argument was that the state of Massachusetts, joined by other states like California, versus the EPA, joined in this case by the automobile-producing states, were in collision over the issue of sequestering CO2. All right. Important facts about CO2. When you're not voluntarily controlling it and when you're asleep, you breathe oxygen in because your system just read CO2 going out. That's a closed-loop process. CO2 is vital to us. I have to tell you, I believe that we have confused, as a society, carbon dioxide with carbon monoxide. Yeah, that is bad. That's bad stuff. That can kill you, and it kills a lot of people. But carbon dioxide is what trees need, plants need to live. That's their oxygen, right? So let's do the numbers. So the posed before us was, if we sequester CO2, and this would be accomplished within a fleet or two of American generation cars, just American, this is all we're talking about, is U.S. produced CO2 from light cars and trucks, what would the effect be on downrange global climate increase? So let's make some assumptions as we did in the amicus that I helped lead with Dick Wilson, who was the chairman of the physics department at Harvard, and Alan Moghissi, the first author of this book. So carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas, right? And so the first question is, of the greenhouse gases, what percent is CO2? And you derive that percentage, and it ranges from 0.9 to 50%, something like that. It's very difficult. So you do range analysis. Of carbon dioxide, what is contributed by cars and light trucks? And that's about 25%. So 25% of anywhere from 9 to 50% gets you down to about 7%. If you assume a linear model between CO2 in the atmosphere and temperature increase, you therefore have an opportunity of about 7% reduction in temperature. So the predictions that we're looking at are modally consensus about 3 degrees over the next 100 years. Well, it turns out that the very best technology that we could identify for sequestering CO2 from cars and light trucks captures about 50% of it. So that 6% translates down to 3%. So 3% of 3 degrees is 1/100th of a degree in 100 years. And so as scientists, we didn't care. We're not in the battle about, oh, we're to blame for global climate change. We're simply looking at the numbers as objective scientists and said, here are your numbers. Here's your opportunity. And do whatever you want to, because at the end of the day, policy is all about politics. So what ended up happening in this particular case in the Supreme Court was really a draw. Actually, the liberal side wrote the majority opinion, but it was not based on the scientific evidence. And I'm going to read to you what they said about the science. Essentially, the conclusion was one of administrative law, and that is, does the EPA have the authority to make a decision about this according to what those legislators had given them as statute? And the answer was no. The Supreme Court felt that the Bush White House and now the Obama White House owes the public a decision-making process for how they decided not to regulate the CO2 emissions of cars and light trucks. And so that's where we are today. Now the EPA has decided that, I guess, that CO2 itself is a toxin. Well, that was another part of the amicus that we wrote. So let me just read for you, word for word, what we said about the science of CO2 as a toxin. I want you to think about these numbers. Thus, while it is true that the dose makes the poison, that proposition has no relevance to a discussion of the nature of CO2 because there is no likelihood that atmospheric CO2 concentrations will reach a level that will create a health risk, let alone reach a level that would be itself toxic. Well, that's a claim. Can we back it up? A study of 9 nuclear ballistic submarines reported average CO2 at 3,500 parts per million. What we're talking about on Earth here is in the range of 380 parts per million that we would encounter. So double that, triple that, quadruple that. I want you to get to 24/7 at 3,500 parts per million with a high recording of 10,600 parts per million, and for 10 nuclear attack submarines, an average of 4,000 parts per million with a peak of 11,000. Yet during the usual months-long deployments of nuclear submarines, this continuous exposure had no adverse effects. See Hager, et cetera, the references. While it is true that submarine crews are composed of young, healthy men, the research is clear that CO2 is not problematic until its concentration reaches about 28,000 parts per million, and there one begins to see slight headaches, and the bulk of the data indicate a no observed adverse effect level, NOEL it's called, for CO2 of about 25,000 parts per million. This is the National Academy's, our National Academy of Science conclusion. So we're talking, we don't have toxicity that we even know about until you get to about 28,000 parts per million. And the worst scenarios that we're hearing about in terms of CO2 production, man-made CO2 production, are in the 380, 400, little over 400 parts per million range. So what's the comparison? We're talking people in submarines for months and months and months endure 30 times as much as the worst scenario that we're imagining on Earth, and as much as, and in fact are not even in the toxicity range, have endured and could endure up to 66 times as much parts per million as the worst case scenario here in terms of man-made CO2 production. So at that point, we exited the fight, and it was assuring that during the arguments, the Supreme Court referred to our work as the science, but then it made its judgment based on administrative law rather than the scientific law. So we're still stuck on stupid with regard to the science.